Lately, I've noticed a growing distance between me and Marianna. It wasn't always like this. When we first met, she was full of life and energy, someone who could light up any room she walked into. We were inseparable, always finding time to talk, laugh, and share the details of our days. But now, things have changed. She's become consumed by her career as a lawyer, and her passion for her work has started to overshadow everything else in her life, including me. It started gradually, almost imperceptibly. At first, it was just a few late nights at the office, missed dinners, and a tired smile when she finally walked through the door. I would ask her about her day, but her responses became shorter and more mechanical, like she was replaying a script in her head. Busy, she'd say. A lot on my plate. Then she'd retreat to her home office, barely looking up from her laptop, and that would be it for the evening. Weeks turned into months, and the distance only grew wider. There were no more spontaneous weekend getaways. No lazy mornings spent in bed just enjoying each other's company. Even when she was home, her mind seemed to be somewhere else, buried in case files, strategy meetings, and court dates. Sometimes I'd watch her from across the room, typing furiously on her laptop or shuffling through stacks of legal documents, and I'd feel like I was watching a stranger. The woman I married was still there, physically at least, but emotionally she seemed miles away. I tried to bridge the gap. I did. I suggested we go out more, take a break from her work, and maybe even a vacation. But every time I brought it up, she'd brush me off, saying she didn't have the time or that the firm was depending on her. Just a little longer, she'd say. Once this case is over, things will calm down. But it never did. There was always another case, another client, another reason why work had to come first. It wasn't just the absence of time together that bothered me. It was the feeling that I no longer knew her. The woman who used to confide in me about her dreams, her fears, her struggles, she didn't seem to need that anymore. She didn't seem to need me. I found myself lying awake at night, wondering where things had gone wrong, wondering if this was just what life was going to be like now. It was a suffocating, gnawing feeling, the sense that our relationship was slipping through my fingers and I didn't know how to stop it. One night, after another long day of her being emotionally unavailable, she finally sat down with me. I had barely touched my dinner, and the silence between us had become almost unbearable. She looked exhausted, with dark circles under her eyes, and her hair pulled back in a loose bun like she couldn't even be bothered to put effort into it anymore. But there was something else there, too, a tension, a frustration bubbling just beneath the surface. "I think I need a break," she said, her voice flat but firm. I blinked, unsure if I had heard her right. A break from what? From all of this. From the city, from work. From everything. She sighed and rubbed her temples like she was fighting off a headache. "I've been running on empty for too long, and it's catching up with me. I need to get away, just for a little while. Clear my head." I sat back in my chair, trying to process what she was saying. A break? It sounded reasonable on the surface. God knows she worked herself to the bone, and I'd been telling her for months that she needed to slow down. But something about the way she said it felt off, like there was more to it than just needing rest. "Where would you go?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She hesitated for a moment before answering. "I was thinking of going to a ski resort. Somewhere quiet, in the mountains. Just for a week or two. I've already found a place. I think it'll help me recharge, you know?" She had already found a place. She had already been thinking about this, planning it, without saying a word to me until now. I felt a pang of something sharp in my chest, resentment, maybe, or fear, but I swallowed it down. This was supposed to be good for her, right? A chance to unwind and get her head straight. I wanted to believe that, but part of me couldn't shake the feeling that this was the beginning of something bigger, something I wasn't ready to face. "Okay," I said finally, forcing a smile. "If you think that's what you need, then you should go." She nodded, her expression softening just a little, but there was no real warmth there. No relief. Just a quiet, tired acceptance, like this was the only option she had left. "Thanks," she said, standing up from the table. "I'll start packing tomorrow." As I watched her walk away, disappearing down the hallway, I couldn't help but feel like something had just shifted between us, something subtle but irreversible. A few days after Marianna left for the ski resort, the distance between us only seemed to grow. At first, I tried to stay positive. I figured she just needed some time to herself, some space to relax and escape from the pressures of her job. However, as the days went by, I started to notice how our communication became less and less frequent. The first couple of nights, we exchanged a few texts, and she even called me once. But the messages were short, curt, almost, and the calls felt more like obligatory check-ins than actual conversations. I remember sitting at home, staring at my phone, waiting for her to send a message or give me a call, something to remind me that she was thinking about me while she was away. But the silence between us stretched on. When she did the message, it was always the same: busy day, just relaxing, skiing went well, nothing exciting. I tried asking her how she was feeling and if she was enjoying her time there, but her responses were vague and devoid of any real emotion. It wasn't just the content of her messages that bothered me, though. It was the tone. It felt distant and detached, like she was somewhere far beyond my reach, both physically and emotionally. I told myself that maybe she was just really tired, that she needed this time to focus on herself, but something inside me couldn't shake the feeling that she was drifting further away. Then one evening, after days of hearing almost nothing from her, she called. I was half asleep when my phone buzzed on the nightstand, and for a second, I wasn't sure if I should even answer. But I did, and the sound of her voice on the other end of the line immediately caught my attention. There was something different about it, something lighter, more carefree. The weariness that had clung to her for months seemed to have evaporated. "Hey," she said, her voice carrying a brightness I hadn't heard in a long time. "How's everything going?" "Fine," I replied, feeling a bit off balance. "How about you? How's the trip?" "Oh, it's been great, actually," she said, and I could almost hear the smile in her voice. "The slopes are beautiful, and I've been spending a lot of time skiing. I forgot how much I loved it." "That's good to hear," I said, relieved to hear some positivity from her for the first time in what felt like ages. "You sound different." She laughed, a soft, almost musical sound. "I guess I needed this break more than I realized. It's just so peaceful here. No deadlines, no meetings, no clients calling me every 5 minutes. It feels like I can finally breathe again." As she continued talking, I noticed how animated she seemed, how her words flowed with an ease and excitement that had been missing for so long. It was a stark contrast to the tired, stressed-out version of Marianna I had grown accustomed to. For a moment, I let myself believe that maybe this trip was exactly what she needed. Maybe it would help her reset, and when she came back, things would get better between us. But then, something shifted. As the conversation went on, I noticed that her excitement seemed to revolve around a certain detail: her time on the slopes and, more specifically, the ski instructor she had met. His name was Philip, and as she spoke about him, I could hear an undeniable spark in her voice. "He's been teaching me all these new techniques," she said, almost giddy. "He's incredible at what he does. It's like he can read the snow, the way he moves, it's amazing to watch. And he's been patient with me, even when I fall flat on my face," she added with a laugh. At first, I didn't think much of it. I mean, of course, she'd meet people at the resort. It wasn't unusual for her to mention someone in passing, but as the days went by, Philip's name started to come up more frequently. In her texts, in the rare phone calls, it was always Philip this, Philip that. How he showed her the best runs, how they spent hours on the slopes together, how he recommended the best spots for après-ski. It became clear to me that Philip wasn't just some random instructor anymore. He had become a fixture in her time there, someone she was spending a lot of time with, maybe even more than I was comfortable with. Every time she mentioned him, there was that same lightness in her voice, that same excitement that I hadn't heard in months. And the more she talked about him, the more I started to feel uneasy. There was one evening, maybe a week into her trip, when I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I was sitting in the living room, watching TV, when she called. She sounded breathless, like she had just finished laughing. "I just had the best day," she said, still catching her breath. "Philip and I went on this crazy run, and I wiped out so hard, but it was so much fun. I haven't laughed like that in forever." As she spoke, I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. There was something in the way she said his name, something intimate. I wanted to ignore it, to brush it off as paranoia, but deep down, I couldn't deny what I was feeling. She was different. The Marianna I was hearing on the phone wasn't the same woman who had left for the resort just a few days ago. Something had changed, and it scared me. I tried to bring it up, to ask her about Philip without sounding accusatory. "You've been spending a lot of time with him, huh?" "Yeah," she replied without hesitation. "He's been great company. It's nice to have someone to talk to while I'm here. Her response was casual, but it only fueled my growing suspicion. I didn't want to believe that anything was happening between them. I didn't want to think that my wife, the woman I had shared my life with for so long, could be slipping away from me, drawn to someone else. But the signs were there, and I could feel them gnawing at me with every passing day. It would be a while before I learned the full extent of what was happening. But even then, I think a part of me already knew. I just wasn't ready to face it yet. When Marianna returned from the ski resort, something about her was undeniably different. She looked content, almost too content. The stress and exhaustion that had once been etched into her face were gone, replaced by an unsettling glow of happiness. It wasn't just physical, either, it was in her demeanor, the way she carried herself, the way she smiled more easily as if some weight had been lifted off her shoulders. At first, I wanted to believe that this was a good thing, that the break had done exactly what it was supposed to do, give her the space to relax and rejuvenate. But the more I watched her, the more unsettled I became. There was something off about it. It wasn't just relief that I saw in her, it was something deeper, something that I couldn't quite place. Every time I asked her how the trip had been, she'd give me vague, generic answers. It was great, she'd say, smiling in a way that felt a little too easy. I needed it. She didn't offer many details, and when I tried to press for more, she'd quickly change the subject or brush it off as nothing special. At first, I tried to convince myself that I was overthinking it. I told myself that maybe I was just paranoid, that her happiness was a sign that things were getting better. But there was a nagging voice in the back of my head, one that wouldn't let go of the way she had talked about Philip, the ski instructor, during her trip. The way she lit up whenever she mentioned him. The easy laughter, the warmth in her voice, it all felt too familiar, too intimate. I started to notice little things after she got back. The way she'd check her phone more often than usual, a slight smile tugging at the corners of her mouth when she thought I wasn't looking. The way she seemed more distracted than before, like her mind was somewhere else even when we were sitting in the same room. And the way she seemed distant from me, even though she was supposed to be more relaxed. More present. The connection we had once shared, the one I had been hoping this trip would help repair, was still absent. If anything, the gap between us felt wider than ever. It was a Tuesday night when everything started to unravel. Marianna had gone to bed early, saying she was exhausted after her first full day back at work. I stayed up a bit longer, trying to focus on a book but finding myself distracted, my thoughts circling her, around us. After a while, I decided to head to bed as well, hoping that sleep would quiet my mind. As I walked into the bedroom, I noticed something unusual, her phone, lying face up on the nightstand. Marianna was always careful with her phone, keeping it close to her, and never leaving it lying around like that. Normally, it was tucked into her purse or left face down, and I had never thought twice about it. But tonight, there it was, unlocked, with the screen still lit up. I hesitated for a moment, telling myself that I shouldn't look, that I should trust her. But the nagging doubt I had been feeling for weeks was too strong to ignore. I took a deep breath and walked over to her side of the bed, glancing at the screen. And that's when I saw it, a message notification, one that made my stomach drop. It was from Philip. For a split second, I considered walking away, leaving the phone where it was, and pretending I hadn't seen anything. But the curiosity, the need to know the truth, was too overwhelming. I tapped the notification, and the screen opened to reveal the full conversation. What I found was worse than I had ever imagined. The messages weren't just friendly or casual. They were intimate and personal, filled with confessions of affection, memories of shared moments on the slopes, and plans for the future. I scrolled through them, my heart pounding in my chest as I read each line. Philip's words were full of adoration, calling her his love, and talking about how he couldn't wait to see her again. Marianna's responses were no different. She wrote back with the same level of emotion, telling him how much she missed him, how much she had been thinking about him since she got back. But it wasn't just their words that hurt. It was the plans they were making. In one of the messages, Philip talked about coming to visit her in the city, about how they could sneak away for a few days, just the two of them. Another message from Marianna mentioned how she was already thinking about going back to the ski resort in a few months, just to see him again. It felt like a punch to the gut. Everything I had feared, everything I had been trying to push away, was right there in front of me. The woman I loved, the woman I had shared my life with, had been unfaithful. And it wasn't just a fling, It was something deeper, something that went beyond a single moment of weakness. She had let this man into her heart, and now she was making plans to keep him in her life. I stood there, frozen, my mind racing. A wave of emotions surged through me: shock, anger, betrayal. Part of me wanted to storm into the bedroom and confront her right then and there. To wake her up and demand an explanation. But something stopped me. I knew that I couldn't just react impulsively. I had to think this through. I had to understand what I was dealing with before I made any decisions. My hands were shaking as I locked her phone and placed it back on the nightstand, exactly where I had found it. I took a step back, staring at her as she slept peacefully, completely unaware of what I had just discovered. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I could feel the anger bubbling up inside me. But I forced myself to stay calm. I knew I couldn't let her see what I had found, not yet. I needed time to figure out my next move. There was too much at stake to let my emotions get the best of me. So I turned and left the room, my mind racing with possibilities, my heart heavy with the weight of her betrayal. As I lay down on the couch that night, staring up at the ceiling, I made a decision. I wouldn't confront her, not yet. I needed time to gather my thoughts, to come up with a plan. Because one thing was clear, this wasn't something I could just walk away from. Marianna had crossed a line, and I wasn't about to let her get away with it. But for now, I would wait. After the initial shock of Marianna's betrayal subsided, I felt a cold, calculated anger take over. I couldn't just let this go. She had humiliated me and betrayed the vows we had made, and I was determined to make her pay for it. But I knew that confronting her directly wasn't enough. I needed something bigger. Something that would not only hold her accountable but also destroy the facade she had so carefully built. If she wanted to act like she could live a double life, then I would make sure everyone saw the real Marianna. I started thinking about what I could do, how I could expose her in a way that would hurt her where it mattered most. For Marianna, her career had always been her pride and joy. Being a high-profile lawyer, she had carefully crafted a reputation for herself as a strong, intelligent, and morally upright professional. Her image was everything. She cared about the way her colleagues, clients, and the world saw her, always maintaining a perfect balance of success and grace. And that's where I decided to strike. I would ruin her professionally, just as she had ruined our marriage. But I couldn't do it without solid proof. Proof that would not only reveal her affair but also destroy her credibility. The kind of evidence that would leave no room for doubt. I knew that simply confronting her with the text messages I had found wasn't enough. If I wanted to make this public and hit her where it hurt, I needed a lot more. I needed undeniable, irrefutable evidence. That's when I decided to hire a private investigator. I had never dealt with a private detective before, but I knew that these professionals could dig deeper and uncover things that I couldn't on my own. They could follow her, track her communications, and find out things that would otherwise remain hidden. It was a drastic step, but I felt like I had no other choice. If I was going to take her down, I had to be smart about it. I couldn't afford any mistakes. I found a reputable investigator after some research and met with him in person. His name was Charles, an unassuming man in his mid-40s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense attitude. He had been doing this kind of work for years, and after I explained my situation, he assured me that gathering evidence of Marianna's infidelity wouldn't be difficult. He was confident he could give me exactly what I needed to execute my plan. "This won't take long," he said as we sat in his dimly lit office. "From what you've told me, it sounds like there's plenty to uncover. I'll start by monitoring her phone and tracking her communications. If she's still in contact with this man, it won't take long to catch them in the act." I nodded, feeling a mix of satisfaction and anxiety as we discussed the next steps. I gave him all the information I had. Details about her recent trip to the resort, her behavior, and the messages I had already seen between her and Philip. Charles assured me that he would be discreet and that Marianna wouldn't suspect a thing. "When I'm done," he said with a cold smile, "you'll have more than enough to ruin her." I left the office that day with a strange sense of relief. The wheels were in motion, and soon, I would have the ammunition I needed to bring her down. But there was also a knot of tension in my stomach, a growing unease that I tried to ignore. I told myself that this was the right thing to do, that Marianna deserved everything that was coming her way. After all, she had betrayed me in the worst way possible. She had broken the trust that had held our marriage together. But as I lay in bed that night, staring up at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to get much darker than I had anticipated. Charles worked quickly. Within days, he began feeding me updates, and with each new piece of information, the rage inside me grew stronger. He didn't just track her phone, he followed her, discreetly documenting her movements and interactions. It wasn't long before he uncovered everything I needed. The first few pieces of evidence were simple enough. Texts between her and Philip that were even more explicit than the ones I had seen. But Charles didn't stop there. He dug deeper, recovering phone records and tracking their conversations. Late-night calls and voice messages, all of it pointed to an ongoing affair that had only intensified since her return from the resort. Marianna was planning to meet Philip again. She was already looking for opportunities to see him under the guise of business trips. Then came the photographs. Charles had managed to track down witnesses at the resort, people who had seen Marianna and Philip together. Not just skiing but spending intimate moments off the slopes. He even found a couple who had stayed at the same resort and remembered seeing them together at the hotel bar, sharing drinks, laughing, and touching in ways that left no doubt about the nature of their relationship. One evening, Charles called me, his voice calm and professional. "I've got something you'll want to see," he said. I met him the next day in his office, where he laid out a series of photographs on the table in front of me. The first few were of Marianna and Philip on the slopes, nothing incriminating on the surface. But then, there were photos of them in the hotel's outdoor spa, sitting close together, their bodies almost entwined. The final photos were the most damning, taken at night, showing Marianna and Philip entering a private suite at the resort, her arm linked with his, both of them smiling as if they didn't have a care in the world. "Is this enough?" Charles asked, watching me carefully. I stared at the photos. My hands clenched into fists, my pulse pounding in my ears. It was more than enough. It was everything I needed. But what truly made my blood boil was the ease with which she had done all of this, the casual way she had gone about her affair as if I didn't exist. Every smile, every laugh, every touch between them felt like another knife twisting in my gut. Charles wasn't finished, though. He handed me a small USB drive. "These are recordings of their phone conversations," he said. "I've also got a few witnesses lined up who are willing to testify. Should you need them?" I took the drive, my mind reeling from everything I had just seen and heard. It was all so clear now. Marianna had been living a lie, and I had been blind to it. But not anymore. Now I had the truth in my hands, and soon, so would everyone else. As I walked out of Charles's office that day, I knew that I was ready to execute the next part of my plan. It was time to expose Marianna for who she was, to show the world the lies she had been living. The day of the conference arrived, and I was prepared for what was about to happen. It wasn't just any ordinary event. This was one of the most prestigious legal gatherings of the year. Lawyers from all over the country were attending, and Marianna was scheduled to deliver a keynote address. She had worked tirelessly to climb the ranks, and now she was at the pinnacle of her career, a well-respected figure in her field. This was her moment to shine, and I was about to ruin it in the most public and devastating way possible. I arrived early, blending into the crowd, unnoticed. The conference hall was enormous, packed with professionals in suits, mingling and chatting before the presentations began. I could feel the tension building inside me, the adrenaline coursing through my veins as I went over my plan one last time in my head. Everything had to be perfect. There would be no turning back once I made my move. I had brought everything with me, the photos, the phone records, and the recordings. All the damning evidence that Charles had gathered over the past few weeks. The proof of her betrayal was undeniable, and now it was time to unveil it in front of her peers, her colleagues, and even her superiors. She thought she could hide behind her professional facade, but today, that would all come crashing down. I waited as the event unfolded, listening with barely contained impatience as speaker after speaker took the stage. Finally, it was Marianna's turn. As she walked up to the podium, looking poised and confident in her tailored suit, I could almost see the satisfaction on her face. This was the moment she had been waiting for, the culmination of all her hard work. But little did she know, this was also the moment when everything would unravel. She began her speech with the same polished grace she always used in professional settings. Her voice was calm, measured, and authoritative. The audience hung on her every word, nodding along in agreement. For a moment, I almost hesitated, almost. But then I remembered the lies, the deceit, and the countless nights I had spent agonizing over her betrayal. No, she didn't deserve this success. Not after everything she had done. As she reached the midpoint of her speech, I made my move. I stood up from my seat near the back of the hall, my heart pounding in my chest. The room was silent except for the sound of Marianna's voice echoing through the speakers. I walked down the aisle, each step feeling heavier than the last until I reached the front of the stage. People began to turn and notice me, confused expressions on their faces, but no one said anything. And then I spoke. "Marianna," I called out, my voice steady but loud enough to cut through the air. "I think your colleagues deserve to know the truth before you continue with your speech." The room fell into a stunned silence. Marianna stopped mid-sentence, her eyes wide with shock as she stared down at me. For a moment, she looked like she didn't even recognize me, as if I were some stranger standing before her, threatening to tear apart her carefully constructed world. "What are you doing?" she stammered, her voice faltering for the first time. I could see the panic starting to rise in her eyes. "I'm doing what you should have done a long time ago," I replied coldly. "I'm telling the truth." I pulled out the folder I had brought with me, filled with the evidence Charles had gathered. Slowly, deliberately, I began handing out the photos to the people sitting in the front rows. Gasps of disbelief filled the air as the images circulated through the audience, pictures of Marianna with Philip. Their intimate moments captured for all to see. I could hear the whispers growing louder, the shock rippling through the crowd as they realized what was happening. "This," I said, raising my voice so everyone could hear, "is the woman you all respect. The woman you trust with your cases, your reputations. But behind closed doors, she's been living a lie. She's been having an affair with a man she met while on vacation, betraying not only me but the very values she claims to uphold." Marianna stood frozen on stage, her face drained of color. She looked as if she might collapse at any moment. I continued, my words sharp and unforgiving, as I revealed more of the evidence, texts, voice recordings, even witnesses who had seen her with Philip. It was a complete dismantling of her character in front of the very people whose respect and admiration she had worked so hard to earn. "I've hired a private investigator," I added, holding up the final piece of evidence. "He's gathered everything you see here. And I assure you, there's more where this came from." The room was now in chaos. People were whispering to one another, some openly staring at Marianna with disgust. I could see a few of her colleagues shaking their heads in disbelief, while others were furiously typing on their phones, no doubt spreading the news to others in the legal community. Marianna finally found her voice, but it was shaky, desperate. "This isn't the place for—" "Oh, but it is," I interrupted, my tone as cold as ice. "This is exactly the place for this. You've built your entire career on the idea of integrity, of honesty, of doing what's right. And yet, here you are, hiding behind a mask, hoping no one would ever find out the truth. Well, now they know." I looked around at the audience, seeing the mix of shock, anger, and pity on their faces. Then I turned back to Marianna, who was now visibly trembling on stage, her hands gripping the sides of the podium as if she were trying to hold herself upright. "I'm filing for divorce," I said, my voice steady and clear. "And I'm going to make sure that you lose everything. Your reputation, your career, everything you hold dear. It's all going to come crashing down, just like this lie you've been living." With that, I turned and walked out of the hall, leaving behind the whispers, the stares, and most of all, leaving behind Marianna, whose world had just been torn apart in front of everyone she had once commanded with such authority. The aftermath of the public exposure was just the beginning. My plan wasn't over, not by a long shot. I wasn't going to be satisfied with merely embarrassing Marianna in front of her colleagues. No, I wanted to make sure that her life, the life she had so carefully constructed, came crumbling down piece by piece. So, the very next morning, I went straight to my lawyer and began the divorce proceedings. I didn't want a simple, quiet divorce. I wanted to take everything from her, her home, her finances, her security. I wanted to make sure she felt as stripped and vulnerable as I had when I discovered her betrayal. The lawyer and I worked through every possible asset. The house, of course, was a priority. It wasn't just bricks and mortar to me, it symbolized everything we had built together. And now, it would be mine. The accounts we had built together over years of hard work? I wanted a significant share, and I wasn't going to leave her with much. I wanted to leave her scrambling, wondering how she would rebuild her life after everything I took from her. The divorce papers were drawn up swiftly. And I made sure every demand was included. I insisted on keeping the house, the cars, and our most valuable assets. I knew she'd fight back, but I had leverage. The evidence I had gathered during the affair wasn't just useful for humiliating her in front of her peers. It was going to serve as my trump card in the legal proceedings. No judge would look kindly on her actions, and I intended to use that to my full advantage. When she received the papers, I expected outrage. I expected her to come storming into our now cold and silent home, demanding answers, demanding some form of negotiation. But instead, she went quiet. No calls, no texts. Perhaps the weight of everything was finally crashing down on her, or maybe she was too ashamed to even face me. Either way, it was clear that she understood the gravity of the situation. Within a matter of weeks, the process moved forward. I watched as the divorce tore through her world like a hurricane. She fought, of course. Her lawyer tried to minimize the damage, but it was no use. The evidence of her infidelity loomed over every negotiation, every hearing. In the end, I was awarded a large portion of our assets, including the house we had shared for years. It felt like a victory, even though, deep down, I knew it was just one step in my grand plan of revenge. Marianna had built a life of prestige, wealth, and influence. I was determined to leave her without any of it. She would have to start over from scratch if she could even manage that. The satisfaction I felt as the judge finalized the divorce and awarded me the lion's share of our assets was a moment I'll never forget. I had won, but the financial ruin wasn't the end. Marianna had spent years cultivating her reputation as a top lawyer, an expert in her field. That reputation was fragile now, hanging by a thread after the public exposure of her affair. And I knew exactly how to cut that thread for good. The fallout from the scandal was swift. Word spread quickly after the conference, with gossip swirling around the legal community like wildfire. Lawyers talked, clients listened, and soon enough, Marianna's once sterling reputation was in tatters. Colleagues who had once admired her brilliance began to distance themselves. Partners at her firm, who had once viewed her as indispensable, started seeing her as a liability. She was no longer the shining star of the legal world. She was the woman who had been publicly disgraced, her personal life and her professional ethics called into question. Clients began to pull out of deals, reluctant to be associated with someone whose name was now synonymous with scandal. Contracts that had been in the works for months suddenly evaporated. She lost not just small-time cases but major corporate clients that had once been her bread and butter. The legal world is small, and reputation is everything. Without it, she was nothing. I heard whispers through mutual acquaintances that she was struggling. Her once busy schedule had dried up, and the offers that had once flooded her inbox had disappeared. She was no longer sought after for high-profile cases or prestigious legal conferences. Her colleagues avoided her in the hallways, uncomfortable with the shadow of her disgrace looming over the firm. I took some satisfaction in watching her unravel. Every time I heard about another lost client or another colleague who had turned their back on her, it felt like a small victory. I had succeeded in not just destroying her personal life, but in systematically dismantling the career she had sacrificed everything for, including her marriage. Eventually, she was forced to step down from her position at the firm. It was only a matter of time before the weight of the scandal became too much for her to bear. The partners couldn't risk keeping someone with such a tarnished reputation in a position of power. Her departure was quiet, but I knew it was humiliating for her. Marianna had always prided herself on her ability to control every aspect of her life, her career, her marriage, her image. Now, all of that was gone. She had been stripped of everything that once gave her power, and all that was left was the hollow shell of the woman who had betrayed me. I had destroyed her, financially, professionally, and personally. And yet, despite all the victories, despite all the satisfaction of seeing her life fall apart, there was a gnawing emptiness that followed me. The revenge I had sought so fiercely wasn't as sweet as I had imagined. But by the time I realized that it was already too late. The damage was done, and there was no going back. In the end, Marianna was left with nothing. The woman who had once been at the pinnacle of her career, who had commanded the respect of her peers and wielded influence in the legal world, was now alone. The house she had lived in for years, filled with memories of our life together, was no longer hers. Her bank accounts, once symbols of her financial success and security, had been emptied in the divorce. Her career, The one thing she had cherished even more than our marriage was in ruins. And as for me, I was gone too. Just another part of her past, now out of reach. At first, I imagined she might have tried to keep up appearances, perhaps hoping that the storm would blow over. But as time passed, it must have dawned on her that there was no salvaging the life she had known. Every door she once thought would always be open had slammed shut. The colleagues who had once admired her brilliance now spoke of her only in hushed whispers, if they spoke of her at all. Her name had become a cautionary tale, something to be mentioned in passing, a reminder of how quickly everything could fall apart. The legal community is not a forgiving one, and her fall from grace had been as swift as it had been brutal. Her romance with Philippe, that fleeting affair that had seemed so exciting in the moment, must have lost its luster too. I'm sure the reality hit her hard, that she had sacrificed everything for a man who was never going to be there in the long run. Philippe was never more than a brief escape from her stress and responsibilities, a distraction from the life she had chosen. And now, with no career to return to, no marriage to fall back on, no home to retreat to, the hollow nature of their relationship must have become painfully clear. I picture her now, sitting in some empty apartment, far from the life of luxury she once enjoyed. Maybe she goes through the motions, trying to rebuild her life, but the weight of what she lost must be unbearable. The silence must be deafening, the absence of our shared life, the absence of her once busy career, the absence of the respect she had taken for granted. I wonder if she blames Philippe or if she's come to realize that the blame lies with her and her own decisions. The reality is that her fleeting romance didn't just end our marriage, it destroyed everything she had built over the years. As for me, I achieved everything I had set out to do. I had broken her, shattered her world, and taken away the things that mattered most to her. My revenge had been cold, calculated, and merciless, just as I had planned. But as the dust settled, I began to realize something unsettling. It didn't feel the way I thought it would. In the beginning, the thought of revenge had been all-consuming. I had believed that once I saw her suffer, once I took everything from her, the anger, the pain, the betrayal would vanish. I thought I would finally feel free. But instead, all that was left was a strange emptiness, a hollow victory. I had destroyed her life, but in doing so, I had destroyed a part of myself too. The satisfaction I felt in the beginning quickly faded, leaving behind a sense of regret that grew with each passing day. The truth is, revenge had consumed me as much as her affair had consumed her. I had become obsessed with tearing her down, and in the process, I had lost sight of everything else. Now, standing on the other side of it all, I realized that there was no going back. The damage was done, her life was ruined, and I was left with nothing but a sense of futility. I knew I couldn't change what had happened. There was no reversing the divorce, no undoing the public humiliation, no mending the career she had lost. Even if I wanted to, the bridge had been burned, and the ashes were long cold. I had won the battle, but at what cost? I stood victorious, but the victory felt hollow. Now, we were both alone, left to pick up the pieces of our shattered lives. And as much as I had wanted her to suffer, I couldn't help but wonder if, in the end, we had both lost far more than we had ever imagined.